Yeah, so really just want to get in touch with you. Tom and I have been working with some of the folks in the DaVinci organization on payer-to-payer exchange. As you know, all the payers went through sort of the phase one of their responsibilities of the Cures Act by offering the patient API. So they're living in the world of the patient scopes of SmartFire, standalone launch flow, all that great stuff. And that went live in July. And so where we're at right now is, so now all that's done, and okay, now it's time to do the data exchange aspect, which is sort of like a phase two. I think the original assumption was that, payer-to-payer exchange, the original assumption was that, hey, we just continue to use standalone launch flow, and it just so happens to be that the requesting app, happens to be another payer instead of Apple Health or instead of some other client app. It's just the app from the other payer, and that's a reasonable assumption. It seems like, hey, that'll work, except the fact that a very small percentage of people actually have credentials to their old payer. So the sort of the reality of things don't quite line up with the technical specs, and so now the team is looking for another solution, and so that might be a little more, used realistically. And so looking at sort of a B2B use case and, doing this more with like a client credential flow. I think they're sort of looking at some of the back-end services parts of Smart. But I think the struggle has been to marry that up with what they've done already. And so I think there's been some concerns about what the plan is right now. And so wanted to at least kind of get your initial, have a chat about that. Yeah.
Awesome. And I think I'm going to be sort of feeling out and asking some naive questions as we go. So I want to understand what sort of the current plan is and what some concerns might be. But before we drill in there, I want to check my sort of rough understanding, which was we had this deadline you mentioned last July for patient access. And, that's a set of capabilities that's been rolled out pretty widely. Obviously, it only works for patients who have an account in the system that they want to access their data in. And presumably, there's also ways to create an account if you don't have one yet. My understanding was that the plan to require payer-to-payer, the sort of B2B exchange, has been kind of deferred without any particular timeline, in part because there haven't been good technical and trust mechanisms for making it happen, and in part because this patient access provides something of an escape hatch. So I just want to double check, like there's not currently a deadline or an enforcement plan that's going to require payers to engage in this B2B exchange, but they're interested for other reasons.
Yeah, you want me to take that one, Dan?
Yeah, if you would.
Yeah, so it's definitely there's no deadline now. It's been paused, but we all know it's coming, right? So we just don't know when and what IG specifically the regulation will point to. We're taking some educated guesses. It's going to be the P2P PDEX, DaVinci PDEX IG that we've all been working on. So this work is sort of going forward to provide a more firmly scoped solution that a regulation could then point to. And we do, I think, internally, we're marching to a 7/1 date, even though there's no regulation. That's just our own personal try to be prepared. I think we've heard rumors that we don't expect the reg to come out until not earlier than Q3 to 2022. So that sort of flies in the face of our own internal deadline, right? But and I don't know how quick they'd expect people to turn it around if they release it in Q3, right? So
yeah, well, I'll say that maybe another spin for that though, Tom, is like from my perspective at least, regulations should be based on technology that we know works in the real world. And so if there's going to be a regulation pointing to some specific IG, it would be really important if before that proposal comes out, real industry players have used that IG at scale. Like when we had the Smart App Launch Guide, just for historical context, I mean, we published that guide, years before it landed in regulations, and it was available at, hundreds or thousands of providers, with some of the big vendors having rolled out support before ONC made any kind of rule pointing to those implementation guides. And for me, like, that was actually a really good practice, because it allowed us some time to learn where the rough edges are. And I'm not saying we found all of them, but we sure found some. And be confident that, roughly this IG was solving the problem. So by the time it was named in a proposed rule, we were able to say, well, we know this can work because here are all the places it's working. So from my perspective, if you're targeting July, that's great, because it'll mean that there's a shot that, we've got some real world experience. I would have to assume that anytime, I don't know if it'll be scoped as a proposed rule or just a new requirement with a certain time lag before it comes into effect, but I have to assume that payers would have, a year to implement any kind of new requirement between when that was announced and when their deadlines were. That would seem pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah, and I don't know why, I don't know all the details of how we got to our date. And why, but it does feel like at some of these connectathons, we're the only payer there that's got stuff even remotely ready to, right? But yeah, I don't, yeah. So I don't know when we get into the specifics of where we're, the options that we're kicking around, right?
And let's drill it. So now I know we're talking about the PDEX guide. There's not a deadline yet, but organizations are setting their own deadlines. Let's drill it.
Yeah, so it would make sense. I can kind of bring up what's been proposed thus far and kind of talk about, like, sort of the pros and the cons, what we agree with, what we have concerns around, and kind of go from there. Because I'm coming at this from the angle of, how does this work with Smart? I know what at least my customers have done with Smart. I know what's there already roughly. How would this fit with that? But also making sure it jives with OAuth and we're not going off the reservation, or if we are, let's have a really good justification for it, sort of thing. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from it. So I'll kind of outline some of that, and we can kind of talk about it as we can here. So can everyone see my screen okay? Yeah, so this is essentially the current version of what's been talked about. And so, the two main problems they're trying to solve is trying to do the payer exchange in more of a B2B way, right? So user doesn't have to have credentials. Maybe the user fills out a paper form and gives it to the new payer or whatever. Just allowing for flexibility, doesn't have to be a standalone launch flow. The other thing that they're trying to solve, just for context out of this, is also trying to solve, if we've got 350 payers roughly, or hundreds of payers, how do we automate that registration? How do we like set up a trust framework or a trust network? And so part of the first part of this spec here, the idea is that they're proposing to use dynamic client registration of OAuth. But what they're doing is they're putting mutual TLS in front of it. So essentially, dynamic client registration doesn't have a real, at least I would say not a very strong indication for how authentication should be done. And so what they're saying is, hey, we're going to use mutual TLS with a common PKI infrastructure to authenticate into the dynamic client registration endpoint. So therefore, this entire first step here, and I think, Tom is, if you have detail here, but I think there's going to be more that goes into, like, how do you get a certificate? How do you actually join, like, a payer community, things like that. But
so like already on step 1A here, like, this is incredibly complicated. This feels like the problem that TEFCA and the various, QHINs have been trying to solve for a little over a decade, and still, don't have exactly solutions in this space for. And then they've got like a 1-year roadmap for when they're going to get folks participating in those exchange networks, and maybe a 3-year roadmap for when they'd be able to do FHIR APIs on top. So, like, the idea of starting that kind of, business to business exchange agreement and API specs now and having it ready in a year seems like very far off base to me.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a great comment. This is why, this kind of context was certainly valuable. And I didn't know that. And so those are the kinds of things we wanted to kind of hear about, because I know we're trying to keep it simple. So I will say, and some of these endpoints are pretty high level, but we know right now there's going to be some sort of a trust network, some sort of a repository that you can download from. I've got a small mock-up of one, but the idea is you should be able to somehow query this directory, get the Firebase URL from that. And then it's not in here, but one of the changes I've proposed is to get the Firebase URL and have the smart config JSON, the smart config, be the discovery to say, okay, what's my authorized, what's my register, what's all of those endpoints. And so it's not on here, but I think that's kind of part of that is querying some registry, doing, and determining what the base URL is, and then using MTLS to call a dynamic client registration. And yeah, it's, so Tom, does some of those other efforts ring a bell? Because that's the other thing I feel like with here is I feel like some of these things are probably being looked at on other tracks. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing is in the security IG, right, with UDAP, and it's pretty similar to what's mocked up here without the MTLS, and you use UDAP instead for the registration, and the cert is in the header of the JOT instead of a mutual connection exchange beforehand. But the part that's not in UDAP obviously is the directory, and I think there was a thought that there was going to be a national payer directory ready for this part, and it turns out that I'm not so sure that it's not ready. I think the cost to participate in it was sort of prohibitive for some payers, I think, especially smaller payers. So they're coming up with an alternative approach to that.
Who's running it? I mean, it shocks me that like cost would be the challenge here, because building a directory from scratch couldn't really be cheaper.
No, I mean the cost to be a member of it was fairly substantial for the payers.
What is that directory? Do you have
that one was CAQH.
Okay, so not a government organization, a third party standing up.
Yeah. So and I know the PDEX folks are working with MITRE, I think, to get a reference implementation of a directory going as well. But so this was a piece that didn't have a lot of detail around it until recently. So, but I know now they're using the term DERSA for the trust document, and when I googled that, it sounds like it came right from eHealth Exchange. So they're supposedly going to be able to put all this stuff together in a relatively short time.
Sorry, it's worth thinking about where this fits into the TEFCA concept, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, because that's supposed to support this kind of business-to-business exchange between payers, providers, other kinds of entities that manage protected health information, and they have a set of trust framework specifications. They have a set of patient identity lookup APIs, and then like data query APIs. It happens to be using like a set of IHE profiles. I'm not super familiar with them. Today, most of what's being exchanged is CDA documents, but I think that payload could be lots of things. Reinventing this stuff in short order, like this is very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not sure where they're. Like I said, I think it's eHealth Exchange. They might be taking it from the existing IHE trust documents. I think they're leaning on that a little bit.
But why create a new network? Like, why not actually participate in the National Trusted Exchange Framework?
Well, for one, right now, payers can't, right? Because it's treatment.
Well,
right?
The common agreement that's being, at least my understanding now, is the finalized common agreement supports access to payment data. I could be wrong on this, but it's worth cross-checking.
Yeah, for TEFCA, you're saying, right?
Yeah, like that final agreement was just published a month or two ago.
Right.
For a while, I think that was in limbo, but I think now that at least there's more clear answers there.
Yeah, I know existing networks. It's basically treatment only. So payment and operations, those purposes of use,
today,
we're not allowed to
yeah,
play.
but
Yes.
fast forward a year, because I
Yeah.
mean, building this from scratch is also going to take a year. So if
Right.
the TEFCA
Yeah.
rails are going to be up and running in that time frame, like starting something new that needs to cover that same scope might also be really hard.
Yeah, and I agree. The other one is, care quality. They have a Fire IG and they have all this stuff spelled out in there, and they're using full-on UDAP. And I don't know what they're doing for directory, but that my understanding, and I have some work coming up where I'm going to be on care quality meetings, because I guess their IG is like 2 years old. They haven't looked at it, and they're going to look at that Fire IG. But so that's another opportunity, right? Because that's, there are care quality implementers on some of these existing networks, and if they adopt their Fire IG as the way to do Fire, then that's another answer for a lot of this stuff as well. But I don't know. I guess I seem to think that maybe there were some commitments made for when this payer-to-payer IG would be ready, so people are marching to that. I'm not positive.
From whom to whom? Like
from the PDEX folks to maybe CMS, ONC, or I don't even know who, but I've heard dates mentioned on the calls, like we have to have something that we can implement this year, is what I've heard. So that's implementable this year. So
all of this preamble then, like the hard part is trust frameworks and agreements and actually building up these kinds of networks. Like if you had that, if I had a TLS cert that you could trust and you had a TLS cert that I could trust, like we don't even need all this OAuth stuff. Like I can just make an HTTP call and say, please look up a patient with this name and this birth date, and you could give me an answer. Like we would have an authenticated connection. Like why do we even need all the infrastructure?
Yeah, well, that's a good point, Josh, because that was, and when Tom and I first started looking at some of this, they were looking at kind of a little bit more mixing of mutual TLS and OAuth, and that was kind of my point. Is like, let's either do OAuth or let's do MTLS. Let's not do both. Now, I feel like this is a pretty good compromise to basically say, hey, we're gonna do MTLS. Let's just do it up front, very at the beginning, and after that, it's all OAuth. And so I guess the only item of note is that, we do have the Fire servers already kind of doing OAuth, right? And so there could be some challenges around not doing OAuth and just doing MTLS only. But yeah, that's a good comment, because I feel like I'd almost rather see us do MTLS out of the box versus customized OAuth, right? So anyway, but yeah, that's a good thought there.
Yeah, we've been around on this one too, actually.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I don't have any deep insight here. I'm just saying, like, this is a big surface area where
it is.
Like all of the magic, to my mind, is happening in this very first step. Like all of my deep questions are about whether we can actually get people those MTLS certs and make them trust each other. But if we could do that, like the rest of the exchange is
right.
So yeah, on that front, and so so on that front, we can kind of just to kind of walk through kind of the current stage, or like where we're stuck at the moment, is so essentially after these green pieces here, so kind of starting in the step 2A, both the payers trust each other from an OAuth perspective, right? So the new payer has OAuth credentials. There's a little bit of a, do we use asymmetric or do we use symmetric? I'm pushing for asymmetric, just like the backend services page on Smart Log.
Yeah, you already got asymmetric auth in step 1 for mutual TLS. Like, why throw that away?
So I'm pushing for that, although I don't know that's been finalized. So anyway, but at this point, the client registration has occurred, and we're doing normal OAuth at the moment. Okay, so in steps 10 and 11, the idea is that they will do a OAuth token request, client credentials, and they'll get an OAuth token back. And what that is then is there's going to be a dedicated Fire. So here in step 2B, there's a dedicated Fire endpoint called member match. and it's a operation on the patient. So instead of patient get, patient search, it's actually a patient member match, and it's a post request. I would, as a non-healthcare, dedicated person, I would call it like an advanced search, with consent transfer. And so the idea is that this token here gets you access to member match, which is essentially, I propose system/patient.s is what I had proposed for that. I don't know that we've got that locked down yet, but I would say that's a patient search. And then the idea is that this step here is a required transaction. You cannot get any of the data until you do this member match. And so here's where I see the rub a little bit is I think the group is trying to mimic in this flow right here. They're trying to mimic what you do on the patient picker, right? They're trying to mimic what you do in an auth code flow where the user logs in, they do the patient picker, they pick a patient record, right? We're trying to mimic that here, where the idea is that once you call this, a member match ID comes back, which is it's almost like a transaction ID. Okay. And then in step 3, what they're doing is they're calling OAuth again with the member match ID. And the idea is that the token coming back in step 17 is essentially like a patient, almost like patient slash, it's like you did launch patient here, right? So yeah.
I understand what you're describing here more or less, although I want to drill into the consent part because that I think is interesting. But an architecture like this is trying to solve a certain problem, and I haven't quite latched onto what problem it is. Because I'll say from the client perspective in this API, it would be much more straightforward if I could get an access token, use it to call member match, and then subsequently use it to fetch data on any of the consented matches I found. It's purely a mechanical runaround if you tell me I have to go fetch another token in the middle. So whose problem is that solving?
That is precisely what I've been. That's yes. So yes, that's precisely what we've been discussing, and what we're trying to get wrapped around our heads around too as well. Yep. Sorry, Tom.
Right. Yeah. So we're trying to get step 3, X'd out. Right.
Yeah. I mean,
so that we follow, and I think the input, we were at I guess it was a PDEX architecture call, and the prevailing initial response to this approach, when we said the second approach is get rid of that second token call and go get the data afterwards. I think there is an assumption that if that second token, and mind you, this is still client credentials, and they're trying to downscope that token to a specific patient, right? So using the member match ID or the ID that comes back from the member match, they want to put it in the token as if it was an auth code flow token scoped for a specific patient. And the reasoning, I believe, is because they think that will allow them to reuse untouched their consumer-mediated, patient-mediated that we rolled out in July. And I think that's a false assumption, because I think there's additional stuff that has to happen with the consent that we touched on, even if you have a patient ID in that token. And we didn't, the meeting we had last week, there was a lot of preamble. We ended up with about 45 minutes instead of a full hour by the time everybody got on and intros and whatnot. So we didn't really get into a lot of the why nots. But the few folks that spoke, and one spoke and then had to leave, he was like, well, yeah, I'm for option A. Like, why would we do it any other way? So and I'm not sure, I'm sort of making an educated guess as to why they came at it that way. And I believe it's because they feel they can reuse what they already have on the Fire server.
Yeah. But yeah, Josh, to be clear, what you just said is exactly what Tom and I have been proposing, and the Sigma team have been proposing, is what value is the OAuth server providing here? And by the way, we POC'd this, so we've got a working example of this, but it just sort of the POC highlighted the fact that the OAuth server isn't providing value because all this stuff is in FHIR data anyway, and we should be using proper sort of, similar to the user scopes, right? So like there should be some back end like relationship that gets set up on member match, and that should be applied in the same way that a user scope in Smart would be applied. If that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, I think right. Using OAuth or like having scopes is not in itself solving a problem. It's only useful if this is like allowing clients to connect to servers with less new work that people need to do, whether it's on the client side or the server side. There's got to be some interoperability benefit to it. Because the way that I would cast all of this would be any payer can make an MTLS protected call to any other payer to say, match this patient. They get back a match ID. And then if you scroll down, I don't know what you do with the match ID, but I'm guessing it's something like eventually you call everything. So when you call the everything operation, you pass in a match ID. And like, could you turn the match ID into an access token in the middle? Sure, but like the mechanics of the authorization and the consent here need to exist independent of that detail. So like there's a lot of steps here, a lot of complexity, a lot of surface area. I think I'm, at a first glance at least, I'm with you guys that much of this could be eliminated, especially since when we finally get to the step here, step 4, row 19, it's a custom operation. This is not something that existed before. This is a new thing called like PDEX everything just for this IG.
Well, yes. So that's the whole other. We've been trying to get rid of that, but in conversations I've had with our guy who's the payer-to-payer guy. So I got pulled into this maybe a couple months ago when they started toying with using UDAP instead of the stuff they have up top in the green. So I don't have the full history on the payer-to-payer, but I believe the PDEX everything. Originally, I thought it was only filtering because payers do not have to provide financial data claims and EOBs to other payers, right? Yeah. So that stuff gets filtered out, but you could do that with scopes, right? You don't need a custom operation to do that. But there are 3 or 4, what I found out last week, there are 3 or 4 resources that they want returned in full that are referenced, right? So like, I think it's like organization, practitioner, those things can be referenced in the data that comes back. And they want to also include the full resource for that ID because it's in this B2B flow. It's not like there's a user sitting there where you can go back and forth and then go get the details on that resource. So I think the PDEX, the everything PDEX operation may stand, and your point is 100% valid. And that's why, like thinking back at the call we were on, Dan, it was presented as a false choice, right? It was a choice of the complexity is on the OAuth server versus the complexity is on the FHIR server. And it was an or, but it's actually an and. Yeah. When you put it on the OAuth server.
If the last step of this workflow was like, get patient ? And then a certain set of underscore includes, which were totally standard, and a certain set of search parameters that were totally standard, I could at least sort of buy that argument about pushing the complexity up. Yeah. But I 100% agree with your point, Tom. Here, the complexity is everywhere. If you've got a custom operation at the end of this workflow, the whole thing could be collapsed into 1 or 2 steps.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, and so that I think the alternative, what we were shooting for before I realized there were these extra resources that need to be returned in full, was the existing everything. So that would be the idea, to reuse the existing everything. That's that sort of quasi argument. But even with that, I still think that before you get there after the member match, there's just because you got the member match ID or the patient ID, which you can get from the URL, right? You don't have to stuff it in the token. It's in the URL for the everything call. There's still some, I think it's dates of the consent to make sure the consent's still valid. It hasn't been revoked. So there's still some, handling that has to happen. And it's not just a straight up, you're going to the patient everything after the member match, which is what I think they presented.
And I also see a hint here, at least, of, let's say, sub-scope level policy requirements. So the idea is there's this consent that might have to do with all data or maybe just non-sensitive data. And even this proposal that like hooks into OAuth in 5 steps doesn't seem to model those policies with OAuth scopes, at least as far as I'm reading it.
We talked about that a little bit, and that's where, and I think that's going to be the next conversation once we land on something is, okay, because there was talk about, do the smart scopes, even the smart V2, do they handle the level of detail that we need? And I kind of had said that I think it might, but we'd have to check. But yeah, I think it's still fair to say that there's probably a level that OAuth, even with the finer grain scopes in Smart V2, even with that level, we may not be all the way there. And certainly not all the way there from a resource, like which resources can you query perspective, that never should be there. So, again, that's where we're trying to, what I'm hoping to do is steer them in the direction of, let's expand the use of smart versus trying to kind of go in a parallel path, right? They're using smart right now for patient access. If they're going to continue and expand the use of smart, they should implement this using the opinions and standards set out by the backend services part of smart. And right now we're not, and I'm hoping to try to steer them that way. And so that's kind of where we're at a little bit. Yeah.
Well, so help me understand this a little bit more. So they're like my impulse is always just to like pretend we've got no history at all and we're solving a problem from scratch. What would this look like? And then think about how much redundancy that would create. So my from scratch solution is basically like, if you're assuming MTLS, great, go ahead and use it. I'm not even sure if you need a separate match and get everything. It seems like in this architecture, you could probably also just combine them. Maybe it has to do with the error conditions, but 1 or 2 steps, match and then get everything, or just match and return, and you'd be done. That obviously wouldn't be reusing a bunch of pieces from Smart, but at least it has the advantage of avoiding unnecessary complexity for this purpose. Spell out for me, Dan, what do you see as kind of the best way that you might reuse backend services to accomplish this workflow?
Sure. Yeah, certainly what I proposed. And by the way, I think what you just said, Josh, is totally valid. It's like, hey, because again, I'd rather them, if we're going to design something, if MTLS is the solution, just let it be the solution. Now, I know there's concerns around, well, we're doing OAuth already. It's going to be complicated to try and do some OAuth, some MTLS. So that's certainly a downside, but I think it's totally valid. But what I would propose, essentially, and I have documented this with some pros and cons to the group, but what I'd propose is everything up until 11, and this is where my naivety in terms of the query is it shows a little bit. But assuming we have your OAuth stuff, no big deal there. You have the system slash scopes here in step 2A. So we'd have a system slash patient.s and a system slash patient.r, both scopes.
And that's pretty much consistent with what's happening here. It's just literally the only difference in the protocol was the scope string would have been changed.
Right, yeah, so far, yes, it's identical. Okay. Yeah, so what I'm proposing is in step 2B, they call the member match, and step 13 is the same. Step 14 is a little bit different. So what step 14 would do is at the same time we return the member match details, the patient ID, and the return back to the client. Behind the scenes, what step 14 would do is insert a consent record behind the scenes. So to create some sort of a relationship, and I'm not defining what exactly, but it's going to create some sort of a relationship that says external payer A has member matched on this patient. So
not a consent record, but an access record, like sort of for an audit purpose.
Yeah, and that's where we probably have to discuss this further. But some sort of an ACL or some sort of a relationship that says external payer has member matched, and we know the consent is good for patient ID 123 and external payer 123, right? So that relationship exists. Yeah.
Okay, but there's a prerequisite here, which is payer B, the one that's going to be exposing its data, has on file some kind of consent from the patient saying that this is okay. Is that what it means to store or compute consent, or is that being supplied by the requesting payer? Like, what's the consent?
Actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but my understanding is actually being supplied by the requesting payer. Yeah.
Correct. So they've captured consent, and it can be. I think it can. There's an option for even manual, right? It could be a faxed in paper, phone call, whatever. It could be a checkbox on enrollment. There's a couple different ways, and it's either, I think, a FHIR consent resource or a document reference to some sort of scanned binary consent, right?
Okay, but the expectation is that the payer, the receiving payer here, payer B, is going to just receive that. They're not going to like look at it. They're just going to be like, great, payer A sent me something that they're saying is a consent, and so because they gave me something, I'm going to trust them and our relationship and move on with this flow automatically. I'm not going to pause while I send it to a review queue for a person to look at.
Correct. And it will have, like, the stuff you talked about, Dan, is in there, right? So you can see it in the yellow, member ID, payer ID. So it's a combination, and they even say store. So your scenario is sort of already outlined here, right? Like, that's the part that I'm talking about that they glossed over in that meeting. Like,
but this implies computable. It implies it's not just a link to a scanned PDF somewhere from a fax. It's like a structured set of data that the requesting payer is attesting to at the very least.
Yeah, I think I'll verify that with Easy. I thought he told me there was an option for a scan, but there's at least some metadata around it, right? That that includes some of those fields. Okay. And I think there's dates too, right? I think there are. I don't think it lives on forever, right? So it's valid for a period of time. I don't, and they, again, the details have been light on some of this stuff so far.
Okay, fair. Sorry, Dan. I interrupted your re-envision flow just because I realized I didn't understand that consent piece, but that helps.
Yeah, no worries. That's where I start to run towards the limits of my knowledge as well, and all that consent stuff. But yeah, but essentially my thought process here is that at step 15, the new payer who's going to retrieve the data, so the client, knows what the patient ID is on the old payer that they're going to get data from, and the old payer has some consent, some relationship behind the scenes, okay, that says that, yep, member match has occurred, this payer is consented for this member, this patient, or whatever, right? So essentially, there's no step 16 or 17. So as a matter of fact, step 18 is just, the client then uses the same access token that they've always had in step 18 to call the PDEX everything, or just the everything, whatever we land on. And so when the FHIR server is validating the access token, introspecting it, whatever it's going to do to validate the access token, it also has to look at its internal stores to say, hey, is that other payer consented for this user in the same way that a user scope would be, and if they are, then yes, we'll return the record. If not, we'll give an access denied. So it's, the actual record level is handled by the FHIR server, fine-grained access controls in the same way the user scope would be. Yeah. So that's what I'm proposing. Yeah.
And there's some kind of session associated with this access token that was created back in step 2A, which the permissions on that session are sort of increasing based on the additional data that's been supplied, like the fact that consent and matching has been done in step 12. And we say, great, well, now your token is good for these things that you've basically proven to us you're allowed to do.
Yeah, that's the thing I will say is a little bit different about this. So if I compare this to like a user scope, like a practitioner use case, for example, I feel like in a practitioner use case, you get your token and the process to get more or less access happens out of band, right? You become on the care team for somebody, or you you get promoted or whatever. In this case, it's a little different because you're using the access token to present some data, at which time that access token can access more records, right?
Yeah. There's obviously several ways you could move these parts around, combining a few steps or separating a few steps. But fundamentally, like, I don't know why it's helpful to push a bunch more responsibilities onto exactly how the authorization dance needs to work, given that like ultimately the server is going to have a ton of custom logic to support what's on the screen here. Anyway, like sort of surfacing it through what appears to be a standard access token call is kind of misrepresenting the underlying amount of custom work that needs to be done anyway.
Well, and that's what we realized in doing the POC as well, right? Like, first of all, I had to do custom stuff with my OAuth server because my OAuth server obviously has no idea what a member match ID is. But then at the end of it, I felt like I had to redo all this custom stuff anyway, and it just felt like extra work. And so and maybe others will come to that same conclusion because, you know, the first time I saw this too, I kind of hummed and hawed about it. I'm like, oh, let's try it. What the heck? It wasn't until I actually really did it that I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, it's too complicated. So maybe others will come around, but yeah, I think a lot of this, bringing you in was just to get your perspective on it. Have you seen this with other teams as well? Maybe we've seen this with sounds like maybe with, at least up here, you've seen this with some of the other teams as well. So I think that was kind of why we decided to bring you in, is to see what your thoughts were on it. And yeah, so,
But I think also to your point, Dan, is to expand smart. Like, I think that makes sense, right? Like some of these IGs are going to be sort of foundational for the way this interoperability moves forward, and they ought to be developed sort of less in vacuums and more, to coexist and in fact, enhance each other.
Yeah, so I mean, we'd love to understand places where the core smart specs could be extended, particularly ways that would be of broad utility. And that's generally, like, we haven't made a lot of enhancements to those core specs. We've had one major revision, Dan, as you're well aware, from 1 to 2. And we're certainly open to doing more work in that space, but like, there are so many directions that we could go in that might not yield fruit. Like, it's not clear to me that this if we took it on, would be something we could like successfully wrap up and incorporate into the core spec. Like, there's a lot of work that's been happening in different parts of the industry, most of which are like within specific trust frameworks to try to hash out these details. And I'm skeptical about my own ability to try to wrangle those different projects. They have their own schedules, their own funding sources, and their own needs.
That's a good point. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think, Dan, the stuff you brought up about the user scopes and the practitioner use cases, I think the comments that came back were like one of our original sort of arguments for getting rid of the second token is that, this is just the first of what's probably many B2B use cases, or if not straight up B2B, at least like with the practitioner user scopes, needing to deal with a token that's not scoped to an individual patient, where the user, if there's a user, has access to more than one patient, right? That's still the same problem that you have to solve, really. And that was met with, I think, something to the effect of, well, we don't know where we're going to be in 3 years or whatever. It's like, well, you can still look ahead. And there were other comments too, like, we've said, and again, I haven't been involved in this payer-to-payer thing for definitely not years. It's been months, and I don't know if it's even been going on. I know that our guy's been there at least a year, sort of tracking it. But one of the comments was, when we started down this interoperability, work, however many years ago, 2-3 years ago, we knew that healthcare was different and complex. And so now we're seeing that it is, so let's customize OAuth. That was like literally a comment, and I was floored. Like I was not prepared to. I did not have a response to it because I was not prepared to. That I didn't think anyone would bring that up that way, I guess.
Well, and that's where I can't disagree that healthcare especially has unique needs, but I mean, that's smart, right? That's why smart exists, is to put the healthcare spin on, put the healthcare spin on OAuth, and it tries to solve these problems. And I think that's, we're kind of in the middle of both. So
yeah, I mean, is that an accurate sort of assessment, Josh, in your mind? Like smart is sort of healthcare around OAuth.
It's designed to provide a set of OAuth profiles suitable for meeting certain use cases in the healthcare domain, sure. But that doesn't mean those use cases include arbitrary like trust framework definitions and like ad hoc negotiation of full details of consented progressive scope enhancement. We've generally tried to only define things that we think are going to be like widely implemented and useful.
Sure.
And the challenge here is within any specific project community, you might look at what's in Smart and say, well, that's not enough. We need to extend it. And then you get people extending in different ways.
Right.
But here, honestly, my concern is just the overwhelming complexity and then the overlap between like what I see in the first several steps of this diagram and the long-term ongoing projects in trusted health exchange development in the US. Like these are all concepts that people have been trying to nail down for at least a decade. And, to start something new here just feels really tough.
Yeah.
Has that come up with the team, Tom? I guess this piece my eyes have glazed over on some of this stuff just because of where I'm at in the flow here. But
I mean, not with respect to TEFCA. I've not heard that come up. I mean, again, for a long time we thought we were going to be using an actual national payer directory, and I would say, hearing that long term for me, I would expect that there would be a single national directory at some point with payers and provider and everybody who needs to exchange data in it, right? And I don't know if that's realistic or not, but that's when you get to, I think that's certainly the goal of, say, a care quality, right? A single directory, and you have maybe a different role, and if you're a payer, those purposes of use, you have different access to different data, based on that. And so I would say my own, I didn't sort of recoil from a directory, because I think at some point you got to start somewhere, right, with the fire side of things.
I'll say, I think that, I mean, I'm not an expert on the TEFCA stuff, but my impression at least is TEFCA does not necessarily anticipate one national directory, but rather a network of networks. And each network maintains a list of who its members are. But if I am payer A and I'm using QHIN X, they're my network.
Yep.
I can ask QHIN X to broadcast out a query for me to all the participants in all the networks. And there's these peering agreements, and I don't necessarily have a list of who all the edge nodes are from every other participant in the network, but I can still write a query that will reach them all. I think that's the sort of intended architecture there. And what a lot of
Yep. No, I think that's true. So yeah, maybe a bunch of regional directories, but I guess the more but they wouldn't be isolated to just payers or providers either, right? I think that's part of the long-term goal.
Yes, and they're not necessarily regional. Like some of them will be partitioned by vendors. So like Epic has a national directory of Epic providers, and they can be a node that peers with others in that network. But yeah, I think that's the architecture there. And so you could have one network provider that wound up providing services for most of the payers. And if it turns out that there's a bunch of things that go beyond the core TEFCA APIs that are going to be useful to payers, like lumping them together in one network could be quite valuable, because that network can provide additional services. But the sort of baseline capability is this broadcasting a query to all the other network nodes and getting data about patients for a specific purpose.
Yep, and I think that's what the IHE stuff does today, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They just do it with, MTLS and SAML and SOAP, and it's not fire.
That's right.
So
great. So yeah, I know we're kind of at time here. I guess my takeaway from this is, I think you call out a great thing around the directory. It sounds like maybe that might be the bigger concern, and that have they considered some of the other efforts in this area? Maybe they should, stand on the shoulders of giants who have already worked on this type of stuff. And then the second part, as I understand, is you feel like this is too complicated overall. Maybe with one option doing just MTLS and nothing else, which has its own set of problems, but I can see the benefit in it as well. Or if we're going to do OAuth, we should probably just do OAuth, and maybe again stand on something that's there already, and probably do something more like this that's in the back end services. That's kind of what I'm reading, but yeah.
Yeah. What is this? What is this smart point to for registration? Is it UDAP or is it something different?
We leave registration entirely out of scope. We point to OAuth dynamic registration as something that data providers might want to support, but we don't profile it. We do call out some registration requirements. So for backend services, we call out that clients need either a way to register a JSON web key set or a way to register specific JSON web keys, and that's at their sorry, I said that wrong. Either a URL to a key set or a specific key set that they provide at registration time. So we call that out and say it's up to the client. The server needs to support both, but it might be a web form that a human being fills out. Like app registration or client registration is not one of the problems that we've tried to tackle yet in Smart, in part because honestly, we've been able to meet our core use cases with a diversity of different approaches to app registration.
That's the one you were mentioning, Dan, in the key set one, right?
Exactly.
It's in the backend services, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where too, I feel like if the directory is solved and if MTLS is used to help establish a trust, I feel like this is a good compromise, because the dynamic client registration in general is fairly loose on the authentication. And so and in return, MTLS is giving us a benefit of identifying the user or identifying the other side. It's in the trust network. It does a lot for us. And so I don't feel like it gives us a lot of value in exchange for a pretty seamless interpretation of dynamic client registration. Yeah. Now the question is, do we use it at all? But I do think if this is what people would be comfortable with, I feel like it would be a valuable way of doing it.
Good. Well, I appreciate your reaching out for this discussion. It's good for me to learn a little bit more about some of the ongoing design decisions that are being made. And maybe my bottom line feedback is just like, let's see this stuff working before we finalize an IG. Yep. So I love the fact that you're building prototypes and deploying this infrastructure on the early side.
Yes, I appreciate that feedback. Well, I think that's great feedback, Josh, for you, for Tom, and for the group as well. Is let's get stuff working, or let's rely on stuff that is proven, right? Because right now none of this is proven yet. And so if they really want to speed stuff up, the way to speed stuff up is let's fall back on stuff that's already finalized,
Right.
A great comment for the group, I think.
Yeah, no doubt.
So.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. It's great to catch up. Yeah. And thank you for letting me record this. I think this will wind up being of interest to a broader community. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your time as well, and so looking forward to more collaboration. So
awesome.
Sure. Thanks.
Take care, guys.
Have a good one. You too.